Good afternoon, everyone. I am Professor Mark Whitaker. I'm hosting Michel Bauwens, peer-to-peer theorist. Our talk today will be entitled The New Digital Coordination, a Challenge to Market Pricing and Government Central Planning from a Third Option of Production Coordination via Digital Ecosystems. And he will talk about the rise of translocal productive communities and network nations. I'll read a short biography of Mr. Bauwens, and then we will begin. Michel Bauwens is the founder of the P2P Foundation from 2005, an observatory documenting working examples of commoning in peer production. He is the author or co-author of many books, the most recent being on the coming digital cultural transition, entitled P2P, a Commons Manifesto from 2019. A Belgian citizen based in Thailand, Michel Bauwens was invited as a governmental consultant in 2014 to craft the state of Ecuador's transition plan to a sustainable commons society. And he was consulted to make a similar governmental plan for the city of Ghent in 2017. He is now research coordinator for an emerging network nation initiative that he'll talk about, I believe, entirely governed through crypto governance mechanisms. In the last 3 years, additionally, he has advised smart.coop, Smart Co-op, a labor cooperative organizing new types of autonomous work sites for digitally aided peer production across 9 European countries. Personally, in his own Cosmo-Local daily life, it combines living in a traditional extended family setting in northern Thailand and his extensive connections to an estimated 34 million technomads, one word, technomads, who are building these new network nations of peer production worldwide. So without further ado, I welcome Michel Bauwens for his talk.
Right. I'm very grateful to Mark for being invited here. I just spent 4 days in Seoul, talking mostly to the cooperative movement. And I visited 2 housing co-ops called We Stay, which I found very inspiring. So yeah, basically, maybe I'll start with just the kind of like basic thesis, and then try to justify the way I think that. Okay, so maybe some of you may be familiar with I think an important book by Michael Hudson called The Decline of Civilization. And so his basic idea is to look at history as this kind of very long-term competition between state-centric and market-centric forms. So it's basically, I might simplify his ideas a bit, but it's like you have the East Eurasian, and including Mesopotamia, that create empires where you have a strong central government, and it keeps the market in its place. And it has all kinds of measures like clean slate legislation and jubilees, which relieve debts periodically, so that you don't enslave your own population. And so it's kind of an ideology of harmony, but it's very state-centric. It has a central power. And then he says what happened is that in Greece, the creditor class took power, and that created a counter-revolution, which was the democratic polis. So Athens, democracy of Athens, is a result of people revolting against debt slavery. And so you have a market-centric, trade-oriented, self-governed, not harmony-seeking, but actually conflict-based model with counter-institutions representing the people. Even Rome had the tribunate, which was basically a permanent structure to voice the interests of the people. And so this kind of like tension between these two models goes on and on over a long period of history, and is coming back in force, according to Michael Hudson, around Ukraine, where you have Russia-China axis and BRICS countries versus Western market-centric system that are still today in competition with each other. So they both have markets, they both have states. It's just the arrangement between the two where the accent is different. And maybe a provocative way to say it would be that, how to say this, that in the US, you can be a president without the support of capital. And in China, you can be a capitalist without the support of the state.
Yeah.
Right? It's kind of The polarities.
Which one is on top?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
All right. So both of these systems are based on rivalry, and when we are in a situation of global overshoot, it's a recipe for eventually even war, and history certainly bears that out. So what if there's a third option? And I believe we now have a third option. And the third option, I call it sometimes stigmergy, which is the language of the ants and the bees. It's a mutual signaling in an open ecosystem. So another way to call it is mutual coordination. So think about open source, think about urban commons, think about crypto economy. So what's the difference? Well, we can take an accounting view on this. So accounting was invented, or at least we found the first tablets in Sumer, I guess 5,000 years ago, more or less. And it's basically the amount of grain coming in and out of a temple. So the temple keeps the grain and then redistribute it according to the seasonal qualities. And it's basically the emergence of the state, because it's an institution detached from the people that starts managing the whole system. The second big innovation in accounting is in the 15th or 14th century with a Franciscan monk, Lucha Pachi, I believe, who is inspired by Indian and Arab accounting, but he gives it a new twist and adds double entry. And that is the basic of the capitalist economy, right? So it's how we see the world as a divided entity competing with other entities. And we're only concerned about what's coming in and out of our own entity. So to a certain degree, it creates a narcissistic system where nobody's really caring about the impact on the environment and on others. Okay. So what is the difference today? So when you do open source, whether it's Wikipedia or Linux or Arduino, anybody can freely join the system. And if they have the skills, they can contribute to what's called a knowledge commons, which can be knowledge, science, technology, code, design. And you can basically see everything in the system. So this is called holoptism. So open holoptical system. So you have pyramidal systems and you have holoptical systems.
How do you spell that? Holoptical?
Holo, H-L-O.
Oh, like a holochain.
Holochain,
okay.
holo-optical.
I see.
So holoptical.
Okay.
Right. So the ability to see everything in a network, right? So this means that you have market pricing still exists. Like I will allocate resources on the basis of the prices. You have government and corporate planning. So a group of people in a hierarchy, maybe even democratically decide what to do with the resources. But now we also have people continuously adjusting to each other in real time what kind of work they will do. So this is mutual coordination. And so the other innovation, of course, this is globally scalable. So this was always possible at the global scale. And maybe some of your students are familiar with the Dunbar number, right? Under 150 people, you can remember people, and basically you can have friendly relationships and just solve problems through talking together. But once you go above, then historically people have created a hierarchical or coordination system to solve the cost, the transaction coordination costs, which go up exponentially if you keep peer-to-peer relationships. And so now we have the capacity to create very complex global projects. And Linux is used to go to the moon, right? And Wikipedia is 100 times bigger than the Britannica. And that's not to say there's no problems, as there are problems with market and state institutions, but they are very powerful at creating very complex technological projects where people can come in and out. And so in these systems, I did a study in 2000, I can't remember actually, but it's maybe 2018, so quite a long time ago. So it was called P2P Value, funded by the EU. And so we looked at 300 peer production communities. So what is a peer production community? A community where anybody can join in a common endeavor, create a digital commons. And then the work has to be managed. There's conflicts that need to be negotiated. There's subsidies, maybe even market income that needs to be distributed. And so how does this happen? And what we found is three fundamental innovations in accounting. So remember, I talked about Sumer, 14th century. That means that accounting is not just like a side issue. It's actually how you see the world, right? So the fact that we are inventing three new forms of accounting is very significant. So I would even argue, in terms of like post-capitalist accounting.
Right.
All right. Which doesn't mean non-capitalist or anti-capitalist, right? Post-capitalist means that something that's come after and may still have many elements of markets and even capitalism, but it adds a new layer. Okay, so those three forms of accounting are contributory accounting. So typically a problem you have in an open source community is that some people get paid and some people will not get paid. For example, in Linux, 75% of people are paid, either by the big companies like IBM or Red Hat, but also freelancers and getting project work. But 25% are not getting paid. And why they're not getting paid? Because they can solve their own issues. So they're interested in doing it for free because they have to solve their issue. And they can, so basically, and so this is important, it's a contributory system. So you have commodity-based value systems where you need to create a scarce resource that you can sell at a higher price and create a surplus. But here, the value can be considered to be all the people that contribute to the common resource.
So for you, the three different kinds of accounting, the third one is the contributing accounting.
Yes.
And what were the first two? First two, historical capitalists?
Well, the state, like the
state is the
temple-based accounting,
Okay.
the state-based
like a
accounting.
state budget-based allocations, distributions.
Right.
Okay.
So the first one is called technically by some people like Alan Page Fisk, authority ranking. So you're obliged to share part of your production with a central authority. And of course, usually it's because there's been a conquest or there's a class society already.
Right.
That will fund all this, the surplus cognitive workers, priests, warriors, because they don't produce. So you need a farming class produces a surplus that is used to develop the civilization, which is competition with others.
Yeah, there's many things that, of course, make a state. I don't want to limit it to one thing, but that's Carniera's argument from the 70s that conquest begins the extraction, not a particular economic system. A conquest and causes people to produce more, to be simply survive. Right. So
I don't remember the word, but like there's a word, I think it's called Synesoism or something in Greece, where at some point people were obliged to go to the cities. Like they were forced to, because that was the only way to to make a wall and to defend yourself against competing armed tribes. So once you have that, like who's going to feed the citizens in the city who don't farm? So at this moment,
one aspect of the state accounting that I found interesting in my research is that states tend to try to make a monopoly of something that's crucial to everyone, like salt.
Right. Like
or
China, right?
So or like a bell in France. I mean, literally for hundreds of years, France had a similar structure, not just China, but or back in the Han Dynasty, the debate over nationalization of iron, basically because everybody needed iron. So once you get the iron from the state, then at that point you are taxed on other things at the same time.
Right.
So creating the monopoly of some sort socially creates that state-based accounting itself. And well, please go. Please continue, Michel.
So okay. So what I'm arguing is that we're shifting from a commodity-based regime to a contributory-based regime, because where's the value come from? So like taking Marx or Adam Smith, you could argue that labor is the source of value, but we can generalize in saying everything that costs anything like labor, energy, materials, right? And then you have to buy them, and then you have to make something new and sell it at a higher price. And so the surplus value comes from engaging in this commodity production. However, in this system, what's happened is that actually every person who contributes to the common pool is a contributor. So the common value pool depends on all the contributors, not just those that are paid, right? So what you get then is a new vision of value dynamics. What you have is a common pool resource where everybody's contributing. That creates the possibility to create a market around it, where various enterprises create value on top of the commons. So for example, if you have free software, you need to install it, you need to update it, you need to train people, right? And that would be the case with every kind of commons that you know it creates opportunity to create surplus around it, and that thing around it could be scarce commodities that you're making on the basis of the common software. Right?
So it's like a platform-based economy, you're thinking.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, but the difference is that in the old vision, you only cooperate internally, and you're competing like in a soccer game or a football game, right?
With other platforms.
Right. So in other words, you're well, actually, football might not be the right example because you need all the rules of FIFA and the infrastructure, but basically, like psychologically, right? Everybody's competing with the other teams. In a commons-based paradigm, all these companies know that they're codependent on this resource. Like they're all saving 90% of the internal infrastructure costs by collaborating on Linux. Because otherwise they would have to develop their own. And for like non-core competitive software, it's very interesting to pool, right? So everybody needs administrative software and this and that. And so you have more and more common core.
Right. And
you're not competing on the common core, you're competing on the added value stuff that may or may not be related to using that common core. So this is important because civilizations transition through value regimes as well. So for example, when the Roman Empire falls and becomes Christian and eventually feudal, the Hellenistic imperial model disdains work. It's for slaves. And a free person, a free citizen doesn't work. He is dedicated to the public good, to the management of the city, does philosophy, a lot of wisdom. But the Christians come with ora et labora, work and pray, because they're originally a proletarian movement. They're from the working population of the Roman Empire. And so they changed the value regime. So after Rome falls, you have a regime where work is now a positive value, right? And it's a tributary system based on local agriculture. So similarly, just saying that there is a value shift is not something marginal. It's actually saying that the core value regime may be changing because of this. Okay, so contributory regime. Around is eventually market activities. And then the question becomes, are they generative to the commons or extractive to the commons? So I would argue that Uber and Airbnb models are extractive. For example, Airbnb chases 15% of the people of Paris out of the city. Right?
How do you mean? What can you elaborate? What do you mean by that?
Okay, so originally Airbnb is one person has an extra room, needs extra money. That's peer-to-peer. But then as soon as Silicon Valley takes over, it becomes people buying 300 apartments. And they're basically hotels. So basically they're starting buying up all the places that are empty in the center of the city and becomes too expensive for the local population and they have to leave. So in Barcelona, there was actually a popular revolt, which brought En Común in power. So like a progressive party in Barcelona became big because there was a revolt in one of the neighborhoods against Airbnb.
Interesting. I didn't know that. What year was that?
That's probably 10 years ago.
10 years ago?
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah, I would say 2011, around the Arab Spring.
So you're saying these are regimes in reaction to these market accounting structures that consolidate zones for profit and bring them into themselves. There's this natural development in reaction to that of these more contributory commons-based pressures. It even gets into the state structures and electing different people in the city,
and then we
city
come,
to perpetuate it.
right, then we come to like a macro historical point of view, something I call the pulsation of the commons, where, so the way I look at history is as cyclic. And this is not controversial in the sense that everything in life is cyclic. Even matter is pulsating, right? And life, and we are born, we die. But similarly, any civilization has a ascending phase, a peak and a descending phase. It's just the way it is. So what happens in the ascending phase, the surplus creating extractive institutions are strong, the state and the market, and they can service the people, in their nation state, on their empire, right? So they provide, they act like the Romans provided bread and games.
As long as the ecology tolerates that.
Yes,
dynamic.
yeah,
It's a wider
exactly.
bubble.
But that's when you reach the peak, either population explosion, or the elite uses too much, or they no longer have like enough raw resources to maintain their army. There can be multiple reasons, but the thing is, everybody for some reason reaches that peak, and then it starts declining. And then what you have is people start self-organizing at the local level. This is basically what your book is about, right?
Ecological revolution. He's talking about the book.
Yeah. So Mark, in his book, which I found, this is a free plug, but seriously, I think it's a fantastic book. Which shows you ancient China, medieval Japan, and post-Roman Europe. Concrete examples of these dynamics, right?
Yeah.
So right now we're in the same period. We are peak, capitalist civilization since 2008. And so people are now reinventing the commons because they need them, because they can't get the services.
From the previous extractive and degradative
I look at Europe, and we had wonderful welfare services, but you look at them now, and instead of having one teacher for 20 people, you have one teacher for 40 people. And I read an article, it's going to be like in childcare, one person for 100 children, right? So this is degrading.
Yeah.
Right. Then it makes sense as a group of parents to say, well, maybe we better do the childcare ourselves. And actually went to We Stay, 2 housing co-ops.
This is in Seoul, right? Okay.
Right. And these are 5 families. They buy in bulk, like the skyscrapers, each 4 or 5 skyscrapers. And they have common childcare, common libraries, a common cinema, a common gym. And it's 40% cheaper than the market.
So this is like everybody's contributing on the same principle. It's a commons, but it's an apartment building at the same time. Yeah.
So it's so here we shift from open source, immaterial, like
and competitive pricing on particular houses.
So first we have like open source, knowledge, Wikipedia, software, Linux, machinery, Arduino. Now we are going to the urban commons, right? So you could say that in 93 is the beginning of the digital commons. So before 93, we have, the chip is invented, I think 73, 74, right? But it takes a while.
Miniaturization, yes.
Yeah, and so what you get is, I was in big business. I worked for British Petroleum back in the days, and for the US government, and different, big institutions. And very typically, we had CompuServe inside the companies, but nobody else had it in the beginning. So you have digital networking for the elite, for the institutions. But in 93, with a browser and the web, you have the beginning of democratization up to, I don't know, like today, maybe 4 billion people are connected. Maybe less, maybe more, but we're in the billions now, right?
We're smartphones from 2019. So that's internet connections is about 5 to 5.3 billion users.
Okay. Yeah.
Smartphones themselves maybe 2.5 to 3.3 billion. So but they're evenly distributed around the world, and that's what I would call smart regions. I mean, so that there's never been a time where so many people had access to this on a digital parity dynamic. Most technologies have a diffusion, and some people have it, some people don't. Cities have it, rural areas don't. But we're in a weird situation where this kind of localism is possible with telecommunications technologies.
Right.
Yeah.
And so, so this is a very good remark, because I was talking to Mark just before we started, and I remember reading, but I don't have the reference, that Korea was the first country where people were sending out more data as citizens than they were receiving.
Mhm.
I mean, could have been changed afterwards, but the idea that, you know, apartment blocks in Korea, people are making pictures, making movies, and all of this was going out, right? And for the first time in history, the self-production of the people was more than the commercial production that they were getting.
And for an analogy, I remember
Yeah.
what they said about early Wikipedia. They thought, how will we pay all these people for content? And then suddenly, or the web itself, people thought,
Right.
who's going to make the content that people want to see? But people are commenting and they're making the content
Right.
for themselves. We don't see it as a problem, but if you go back 30 years, people really were in a bubble. They thought they had to be some individual market incentives to make content. But, you know, the web itself has become very peer oriented, despite the fact that it has privatized
Right.
platforms within it. The web itself is still freeware, basically,
Right.
thanks to Tim Berners-Lee. He didn't
Right,
actually patent
exactly.
it. He intentionally didn't patent
Right.
it.
And so here's the point.
Yeah.
So we
He
never
didn't put
had
it into the accounting. He could have
Yeah.
put that into the accounting. But
Yeah.
Go ahead.
we never had this capacity for global
Yeah.
self-organization of civic networks.
Right.
And so here's another thing that is so important in the contributory revolution is that civil society has become productive. So like so many people are educated, you know, over 50%, maybe 70% in some countries. Right?
Korea is over 64%, I think,
Right.
with some kind of undergraduate degree, highest in the
Right.
OECD. Yeah.
Right. So the highly educated people with all kinds of technical expertise, self-organized over digital networks. This means that the state and the market are no longer the primary vectors of value. That self-organized civic society.
Not just value, but production itself. Yeah.
Yeah, but you're, you know, like in Belgium, there was an example where Antwerp is like the worst country for traffic.
For a city,
It's a big port city in Belgium. And, you know, the government had worked for like 10 years making this plan and bridges and tunnels and, you know, and the people didn't want it. And they created an activist organization and they made an alternative plan. And they won. So the city had to adopt the plan of the citizens, self-organized expertise above their own professional urban planning.
So sort of to make it into an abstract thing, you're saying when this kind of privatized accounting reaches its crescendo, it's creating more externalities than anything else, because and most people are not really participating in it. And so like urban commons you're talking about, I can see this also in the rejection of car-based plans for Copenhagen and Denmark.
Yeah, absolutely.
So toward bicycles, which was a rejection of these centralized accounting, privatized organizations.
So you can, the important thing is that we can choose now. So let's say this is a job I did in Ghent for the mayor in 2017. He asked me to map out the urban commons and to, you know, analyze what was happening and then to do policy recommendations.
How does that mean? What do you mean map? What kind of data is the map?
Okay, so in 2008, after the crisis, the financial crisis, GFC, there were 50 organizations in Ghent mutualizing provisioning systems. So groups of citizens who decide, you know, we need renewable energy and the government and the market is not doing it. Well, let's do it ourselves. Or I want organic food for my family, but again, it's too expensive in the shops and the government is not doing anything, right? So then you can create a collective purchasing group. You go out looking for bioregional farmers and you say, why don't you, you know, give us food? We avoid the middleman and, you know, you can have guaranteed income and we can have guaranteed organic food. And this is called a community supported agriculture model. So if we went from 50 to 500 in just 10 years, actually 8 years.
And this is just in production. I mean, the same thing's happening in education, the same thing's happening in money systems.
Well, look at education. How many people today are learning? I have a good
from
friend.
Us today, maybe.
Yeah. Well, so here in Korea, I have a very good friend that you might know, you know, Gibin Hong, who decided to go out on his own and he's giving courses on political economy outside of the university. And, you know, he has enough students to make, I don't know if he's getting rich out of it, but he's making an income by providing a peer-to-peer learning environment, right? And so this is exploding. So it's renewable energy, housing, housing co-ops, car sharing, not the Uber model, but like by neighborhood. So I was just speaking to a Canadian, Tom Armstrong, who was also speaking with me the last 3 days. And he says in Canada, the housing co-ops, routinely provide parking spots for car sharing. So you have, I don't know, 100 families in the block, and they can decide to buy 5 cars. And they have an app, and they can always have a car at their disposal, but they don't have to own it. And that saves them 80% of the budget for transport. So if you can, so the other thing is, it's not just cheaper, but it uses less matter and energy, right?
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah.
So typically, like a car sharing project, every shared car will save 9 to 13 private cars. So that's oil, rubber, metal. So if you want to save the planet, it's not just like technical efficiency. Mutualization is the name of the game, and there's nothing new. Like, one of the stories I like to tell is about European history is that, so in the 5th century, Rome fell, and it couldn't access the food from Egypt. And in Italy itself, it was like wine and olives, slave-based, big latifundia, as they say in Latin, or in
Trivial pursuit.
yeah.
Right there.
And so what happened is that eventually, the monastics emerged, and they created the Benedictine order, ora et labora, work and pray. And in 50 years, they had restored the agricultural production. So it was a craft agrarian congregation, organized people around prayer and work, but they were farmers and they had forges. And so that was mutualization. And you look, if you ever visit Italy, it's amazing, because after 4 generations, the monastery would be the richest in the region.
Yeah.
And they basically had a middle-class life with private apartments for every monk, while the farmers were still living in huts. Right. So this was not like inefficient at all. This is just as Linux is more efficient.
There's a book about international spice trade that I read once, and the author was expecting to find poverty in, like at 900. Was expecting to find poverty around 800, 900, but he says, well, all these monks are, eating spices from the Middle East, and they're brewing beer, and they
In the heyday of the medieval period in northern Italy, southern France, Belgium, Netherlands, we had a 5-day week. The skeletons of the women are taller than today. And basically, there's been a study, a very famous study about the Inquisition, which basically destroyed this 3-century-long local economy. But so they found out that a farmer was only working every 3rd day, right? Because he had the weekends, he had the religious festivals. So these people are not doing badly. It started derailing in the 14th century, but for 3 centuries, this medieval commons-based economy, and I'm saying this because you had the monastics, but also the guilds in the city, right? Where the means of production were owned by the guild, and you had a whole system to organize work.
And even though we're talking exclusively about urban issues, I mean, there's still rural commune-based structures as well.
And the commons, they existed all the time, but there's like a peak growth of commons in the 11th century, where all the farmers start signing contracts in Belgium and the Netherlands about maintaining their common land. Okay, so let me think about the thread here. So contributory regime, open source towards urban commons. Okay, I think we're now in a 3rd phase. So if you follow me in this, the urban commons is actually less production than mutualizing consumption at the beginning, except for 2 things, energy and food. However, we now have something called, what I call Cosmo-Local production. So there is, especially after Ukraine war, there is now a bi-globalization. You know, the Russia-China axis and the Western axis are splitting. And there is a new consciousness of risk, right? So people are reorganizing the supply chains, taking into account political risk. So America is now in a re-industrializing drive that is as rapid as after World War II, unprecedented reindustrialization. Unfortunately, Europe is deindustrialization because of the issues around Ukraine. But so there's a lot of countries are looking like, how can we do it differently? And so this gives a push to relocalization. That can be continentalization, it can be nationalization, can be bioregionalization, can be municipalization, right? But people are actually looking at, aren't we safer if we do things ourselves or buy it from closer by? So what is cosmo-localization is two principles. Everything that's heavy is local, and everything that's light is global and shared. So you use distributed manufacturing techniques to relocalize your production, but then you create a commons of knowledge. And so you move from economies of scale, producing more of a small thing, to make it cheaper, but using more matter and energy, and you move to economies of scope, doing more with the same thing. So any innovation in the network can be used by any node in the network. So this is cosmo-local production, and I actually believe this is a civilizational principle. Right?
Is this different than peer production in your view, or similar?
It's similar. So, I mean, theoretically, you could have capitalist cosmo-localism, and that actually already exists. There's a company called Arrival. They reduced the car making complexity from 500 processes to 70. They have a central platform, physical, and they make cars and vans on demand for cities. But the IP is not global and shared. The IP is global and private.
Okay.
Right. So it could, you could imagine
it's the same use of the digital technologies too, but it really depends on the choice of, you're saying, the accounting system, or the way the profit is organized, or whether it's mutualized, or whether it's state oriented. So states in China, states are the same technologies are building a social credit system. I mean, they basically So it's not. So
it's how do you so okay, maybe this is interesting because it allows me to talk about crypto. So I think what crypto is actually building this infrastructure, right? And so if socialism was the ideology of the labor class.
Hello, Barbara John.
Hello, Professor.
Hello.
Go ahead.
I would say that libertarianism is the ideology of craft workers, and today digital workers, project-based, they have the same mentality. So libertarianism is much behind the ideology of building crypto.
Right.
But it's based on open source, it's based on community, and it's creating open ecosystems of mutual coordination. And so you can use crypto and adapt it to commons-oriented projects, or you can use it as a big, really financial system,
or a state-based social credit system in China. I mean, so
but you will tweak, right? You will tweak the technology to your own uses, right? And I always say that we have capitalism because we had capitalists, right? It's because we didn't have a big empire in Europe, so a lot of independent free cities allowed the guilds and the merchant guilds to grow and to build a society based on their needs and image. And that eventually, after a few centuries, created the bourgeois type of society. But similarly, if people are commoning and are adapting markets and state forms and regulations and technology to their needs, that creates another type of society. And of course, I prefer cosmo-localism as a model where you have more local production. So in terms of thermodynamics, ecology, we spend 2 times more on transporting than on making. So this thing here is 1/3 making and 2/3 transport, right? So mutualizing production and provisioning systems is an enormously efficient way to bring down matter energy costs.
Mhm.
And there is actually a movement now in Europe, it's called factor 20 reduction.
Mhm.
And so example in a German city, but I forgot the name, I'm really sorry about
Okay.
this. But they replaced the commercial transport system with electric vans and cargo bikes. So zero carbon. They saved 95% electricity, energy for the same amount of commercial transport. So imagine doing this systematically, right? This would be a commons-oriented policy to deal with the resource scarcities that we are facing in the future. And so this would be embedded in our crypto coordinating systems, because the shift from private accounting to open ecosystemic accounting. So you have contributory accounting, which we talked about. We have flow accounting. This exists, it's called REA, resources, events, agents. So no double entry, but every transaction shows you your place in the network. So suddenly you become conscious of your ecosystemic place, not just privately, but as a system.
Mhm.
Then you can add thermodynamic accounting, which is I think what you are doing. Right? Your
Circular
commodity,
economy issue,
your commodity ecology system as part of this, right? And so every group, every productive entity can see this is how much we're using,
right,
and then you can build in limits.
right.
So this is called global thresholds and allocations. So you have like a global group of scientists who keep track of availability.
Mhm.
And then this is the difficult part, the political part, like who gets what.
Mhm.
But once that is solved, like you can at a local by regional level say, well, we have to stay within these limits,
Mhm.
otherwise we destroy our resource system.
Mhm.
Right? So this is called a resource balanced economy.
Mhm.
Right? And technically, I think that's what you're trying to do with your
Mhm.
system that is funded by the
Right,
Korean government.
right, right.
You're gonna get some water.
Sure, yeah, let's take it, yeah.
So I don't know if you're.
Would you like to sum up for 10 minutes or based on your notes? I mean, we're almost out of time and we could take some questions as well.
Yeah, I think I've said pretty much
You did talk
everything.
about a network nation. What's this
Oh,
network
right.
nation
Okay.
idea?
Yes. And then I'll stop with that, right?
Okay,
Because
okay.
I think it was already pretty dense. So what is a network nation? So you could see the history of civilization as a history of geographic organization.
Mhm.
So the idea is that we had a big climate change issue, in 12,000 or maybe 8,000 BC, which dried up North Africa and swamped Mesopotamia. So either people left or they decided to organize irrigation, right? So that's basically what civilization is about. It's about mastering nature and creating a complex organization that's able to do that, which needs a surplus, creates a class society. But it's basically a relationship between the city and the countryside. Now what we're doing is we're creating Cosmo-Local productive groups that are translocal and transnational.
Mhm.
So we have geographic interstate. We have transnational finance. What we didn't have was translocal civic organizations.
Mhm.
And our political problem today is because the state is less powerful than transnational finance, we can no longer change a lot of it at the state level. But if we build productive ecosystems that intercooperate,
Mhm.
that have global digital commons, then we can build powerful social power that is a counterpower to the transnational finance.
Mhm.
I hope that makes sense.
So it's sort of, I mentioned this before, but like a digital Hanseatic League. Hanseatic League
Yeah, absolutely.
is
Yeah.
a city of regions that were very commercial. They didn't develop much culturally, but what you're suggesting is this is also sort of a cultural movement as well.
Yeah. And so the way you organize this, and I'm actually working for a diasporic group called the Global Chinese Commons. And what is a network nation? It's people who translocally, so they have co-working and community spaces all over, like around China, and so they're digital nomads, and they're creating one community, right? And they use crypto governance like quadratic voting to make decisions. So in order to join them, you buy an NFT. that gives you 1 week in their centers, and they onboard you in their system. And then to the degree you contribute to the network, you get voting rights, right? And it's also interesting because they build an anti-oligarchic governance system. So because Bitcoin is actually very centralized in terms of ownership, you know, if you don't want $1, 1 vote, you want 1 contributor, 1 vote, then you need to build systems that are countervailing towards the accumulation of centralized money power, right?
How do they do that then?
I'm not sure exactly, but it's through these governance tokens, right? So if you do things like you translate text for them, so you contribute to the network force, to the common infrastructure that everybody benefits from. That gives you tokens, and according to your tokens, you have voting power. So it doesn't depend on your money; it depends on what you've done for the group. Yeah, it's different. You know, it's very so they have they use DAOs, distributed autonomous organization, to do this. And I went to a festival in Montenegro called Zuzalu, which was organized by the Ethereum Foundation, and 300 people for 2 months, everything self-organized, and there were at least a dozen network nations there. So this is something that's already there. Maybe another example, this is not network nation, this is a Cosmo-Local production network, is craftspeople in Europe are looking for like cheap rent outside the city, you know, like old factories. They organize as a co-op, they use open source, and they have, it's called the Invisible Factory. So this is their commons where they locate all their knowledge and they learn from each other, and they're like 120 places working together in the Invisible Factory, right? So this is happening. This is not just like a futuristic thing. I'm not saying it's the core of the economy yet, but I'm saying it's quite important already. And this is where a lot of innovation is actually happening.
And that's where on Monday we'll be talking about circularity of the commons and the dynamic of, you know, the problems, why these more mutualized, you know, contributory structures are being created is dearth. I mean, there's you know, there's more problems of the environment, there's more problems of labor and payment, there's less stability. So they're building their own stability systems, but they're very mutualized, but they're on the periphery at the beginning. But as the center collapses, this becomes a more of a hegemonic tool for organizing life. And that's, so it's really like a lifeboat. Basically what we're talking about is like, what's the lifeboat to continue civilization if our centralized systems and, you know, large scale production and international shipping collapse?
So this is where your jurisdictional license come, right? Because what you have is, let's take a historical example. So the Roman state collapses. What is left is the church and the barbarians, the Germanic peoples, and they have to make an agreement with each other, right? And that creates the base of new civilization, but with totally new forms, like monastics, which were marginal originally, just people leaving the big cities.
But you know, if we substitute the word monastic to mutualize, I mean, that's what they are. They're mutualized communities. I mean,
non-religious mutualization.
So if we strip out, I mean, some people will say, well, religion's not important, but if you just look at the structure of the institutions, what's happening is these mutualized institutions are developing on the background, whatever they are. They could be production, they could be religious, as you said, work and pray organizations and the Benedictines.
And you know, so,
or even now the Chinese diaspora working together globally in the network nation you're talking about.
And so, I mean, there is an ideological aspect to it, which is, you know, what is binding your work together, right? And
what were the principles of the other network nations? I mean, you mentioned the Chinese, so that's sort of the ideology behind that.
There's only one that I really know, which is called Afropolitan, that has a bit more of a venture capitalist tinge to it. But this is for the African diaspora. You know, there's so many Africans in the US and Canada, and they
so that is the ideology, sort of a racial, tribal dynamic.
Yeah, Pan-African ideology in this case, right? In the case that I'm working for, this is like pan-Chinese in a way, but they, you know, they don't want to be restricted. In this case, they want to offer opportunities for Chinese people to come in and out of China and to be able to work in crypto. That's basically their aim, to create like a hedging there.
When did this begin? When did this project begin for them?
Maybe 2-3 years ago.
right after China bans crypto for a lot
Exactly,
of
yeah. Some of them are,
So this is a
Bitcoin
reaction to that's what we're
miners,
talking about. It's a
crowdfunders,
reaction of
yeah,
the dynamics.
yeah.
So it's,
So it's a labor, in my view, it's a labor aristocracy of
Mhm.
highly educated technical workers, which are a bit like the craft workers in the Middle Ages in the 19th century, because they carry their own tools, which is basically the computers, right? So they depend on the network, but they're not dependent on everything. They and so 34 million digital nomads are people who can work from anywhere, and they're building their own infrastructures. But this can be a powerful weapon for any region that attracts them, right? So now we see nations like Portugal competing to attract as many digital nomads as they can, because these people bring, of course, they bring money because they have to live there, but they also bring knowledge, and they can connect to the local population. And that's what Thailand is doing. Chiang Mai, where I live, is probably the world capital of digital nomads.
Really?
There were 25,000 before COVID. And as far as I know, it's exploded.
So states in the future, you're saying, may be a central capital node for a lot of digital nations, multiple digital nations.
Well,
like
the
bringing
way,
it together.
the way I formulate this is that,
Multiple network nations.
I think the nation state will exist because you still have territories. I don't know, maybe they will change form, like become bioregional, whatever, federations. But we need geographic management of, the watersheds and all of that. But on top of that, there will be a nomadic structure, and it is of interest for these local governments to attract this nomadic capital.
That's what reminds me of the debate back and forth in Korea between accepting and banning crypto, because they don't want it to dominate their economy, but they're afraid to be left out of the dynamic. The same way with the Ottoman Empire in the 1700s, they didn't like the fact that a non-calligraphy based mass printing was starting to take over knowledge production, so they banned it for 300 years. But this, the countries around them still developed. So eventually the Ottomans said, we give up, and they had a quick mass production of books from the late 1700s.
Yeah, and I think in this sense, China's banning of these things is probably not the best option. So I think a country that doesn't do it does weaken itself. And a neoliberal government, wants to attract financial capital, but I think what I call the partner state model, right, which is enabling local individual and social autonomy, has an interest in attracting those people. But
it's sort of like what, to quote Lenin, it's like, the capitalists will sell you the rope they hang themselves with. So you're saying that, despite it being neoliberal private accounting systems seeking profit, they're really inviting an entirely different mutualized structure into their own economy.
Yeah, and of course they're trying to,
because the others are collapsing, basically.
Yeah. Okay. They're trying to, adapt to this. So by regulating it but so these are forces that. So I'm not saying this will be the only thing. I'm saying that we move from a binary policy context of market versus state to a triarchal institutional setting where you have to think about market and state, but also about the commons. And in many cases, it will be advantageous for states and markets to enable more commons because they use less resources, make people more happy,
to be witty, commons more capitalistic productive, you're saying, basically.
So
without
more productive.
No,
I think the crypto commons world is more productive, but it's actually less capitalistic because it's the contributory value is core, and the market becomes at the service of the contributory core, and market entities become dependent on their common dependency on their joint commons. And eventually that happens with the state as well. The state becomes realizes it needs healthy commons to be, to survive in a difficult transition world.
I think that's a good way to stop, and we'll stop here and take a few questions from any audience members who would like to show their face and talk to us too. Are you there, Barbara John?
Yes, hello. I'm here. Unfortunately, I was a little late, but from what I heard, it was very interesting speech. I think the network societies that you've just mentioned, it's something that I didn't know actually, and now I'm just very interested about it. So from the classes that we used to take from Professor Whitaker classes, we remember the triangle where technology, society, and government would be interacting with each other. But with network societies, I see this broken link that where the government is not there anymore, as you're mentioning that the voting right is determined by the contribution you're making and the tokens you're earning and all these NFTs. The one concern that just came to me while listening to your speech was that the role of the government of sort of controlling the people and establishing a law and making sure that law is followed. I was thinking about that. How is the policing will go about it? Where the regulations will be upheld? Who will it be done by? If we are skipping the government's role in it, in these network societies, what will that be like in the future? Maybe those are the let's say these network societies are small scale at this point, but once the scale gets bigger, I'm sure we'll have lots of people that are not so well intended, right? They might be great contributors, they might be earning lots of points, lots of tokens, but then in the end, they don't want good for people. So
theoretically, you're talking about the free riders that will come onto the successful network nation. How you handle people more selfishly inclined just to join a good thing.
Well, if they're selfish, then it's fine. My biggest concern is what if they're ill-intended?
Right.
What happens then?
Well, I mean, this is already happening, of course, so
Right.
first of all, Bitcoin is a very speculative currency. So it's, yeah, is involved in all kinds of things, but it's also used for a lot of criminal activities, right?
Right.
So, I would say that within the network paradigm, there's also struggles and contradictions and different ethics of different groups. And so I think we need geographic entities that protect the geographic environment, but we probably need new types of, translocal institutions as well.
Right.
That isn't just vote by the number of coins you have, but like you said, that the Chinese network nation, they were trying to find ways of using, equal rights of voting and not per se just however much they've financially devoted into the system.
Right. And, so an example would be, so there's a project called Prospero, I think it's, or Prospera in Honduras, where the former government made a deal. And so is a crypto group that takes over an actual city and is giving total freedom to do what it wants. One of the things that some people find attractive is that there's too much medical regulation. And so they want, to have more people more easily testing medicines. Is that a good thing? I'm not convinced, right? But that's a typically libertarian idea. And also, generally speaking, I would say that most libertarians think about escaping the catastrophe. So they, everybody realizes the world is on a descent right now. But so let's have crypto, and then we can move around. And if it goes bad here, we can go there. So you can very easily flip into some kind of like parasitic ideology where rich, educated people think about themselves and how to escape issues and where's the best place to go. But there's also within crypto another polarity, which so I'm associated with something called the Crypto Commons Alliance. I'm not very active with it, but these are like the people who think most like me. And they want the commons aspect of crypto to be more dominant, right? So they're devising not Bitcoin, but mutual credit currencies. And they're designing DAOs that work differently, that are more social. So that's what I expect to happen, is that so in capital you have capital and labor. That was a traditional divide, but now in crypto there's still a divide in crypto. And so this system is dying. The capital labor system is dying, but it's still dominant. And this system is growing. So you have basically two conflicts, right? And that makes for a very complex transition where it's very hard to predict. But so my vision is, and it's just a vision, of course, is that at a global level, we need to fill the commons gap. So we have international state system, transnational capital. I want translocal civic organizations that can protect the commons. And I call them magisteria of the commons. And I think because the state and market are extractive by nature, they're based on growth and expansion, that we need commons-based institutions that are strong enough to regulate. I don't know, it sounds weird, that the commons regulates the state rather than the state regulates the commons, right? But I believe that is in the cards, that we could have, we don't have them yet, but think about like the prototype, the FLOSS federations, the Free Libre Open Source Software, Linux Foundation, Wikimedia Foundation, they're very powerful organizations already, right? And they are there to protect their commons, to go to courts, to protect the common IP, to train people, to have conferences, to create national and local groups. And so maybe, okay, this is maybe utopian, but there's a group called Sovereign Nature. And I think they have something, which is, why don't we make a forest into a DAO? So the forest owns itself, is represented by a DAO, has sensors, can hire people, can get revenue, and can pay people who protect it. And as crazy as it sounds, that's how people used to think about it, because the forest and the mountain used to belong to the gods, right? And then you had seers that would interpret the will of the gods, and so that was used to protect nature before capitalism. Like indigenous people in Latin America, they have a lot of these sacred places, and people don't overuse them because it's not from them, it's from the gods, right? Okay, maybe we can't do that anymore, but we can have sovereign nature. Maybe we can find ways, and I think that's where these new technologies can enable like totally new forms of governance that we don't even think of today, but that could be,
It reminds me of a book by Wiseman, who's a journalist, wrote a book called Gaviotas, which is Spanish for seagull. There was an intentional community developed in Llanos, which is a L-L-Y-A-N-O-S, the Llanos of Colombia. So nobody wanted to go there. So it says geographic commons. It seemed really dry. There was no water. There's no trees. But literally in 20 years, they're building a forest. They're building a forest and they're building production out of that forest. And so they want to grow that forest as they're doing other things. So it's a community of intentional technologists, and it was respected equally by all the warring parties of left or right within Colombia's long civil war. So nobody wanted to screw it up. So there's a lot of respect for people that are trying to build, I think, these commons institutions for living good in one particular place. And what Michel is saying, once we live in these new digital coordinations, all these good little places might want to collaborate on the information commons. And, they'll have better, lateral learning about how you do certain things more ecologically. Basically, it's the commodity ecology platform. It's the idea that you learn how to live well in particular areas by sharing how those links are created in all zones. And, that kind of synthesis of information, I think, is what he's really talking about. And that's why, we have so much in common. Any other further comments for Richon? It's good.
Yeah, so the second one I had, every time we talk about decentralization and every time we bring an example of a Bitcoin, there is one aspect of it that people seem, I would say it's also as important as an energy consumption part, because generating Bitcoin and upholding this distributed ledger of Bitcoin is an extremely energy requiring process, right? And we end up consuming so much energy, and that's actually is holding back the Bitcoin from being popular use. And if we try to move this from the physical locations as you mentioned to transatlantic, right? Transatlantic locations, and create these network societies. And if we are talking about, again, tokens that people should be earning to have a right to vote. Those tokens should be stored somewhere, and it cannot be centralized. It has to be decentralized. So we end up talking about more and more about this decentralization. And with decentralization equals to energy consumption. That's the point I was trying to make here. And I don't know how it will come into play if these network societies end up growing.
I think Michel had talked about, I don't know where when you popped in, but he was talking about, it's true, a lot of costs of things are in transportation. So if things could be, whether we have, 3D printing of something, in supremely local places, you could order a copy, of something that we've made locally for you. I mean, that of course is far in the future for multiple material items, but go ahead.
So you have to balance things out, right? So there's on one side potentially the capacity to lower our matter energy usage by 80%. On the other hand, there's the cost of maintaining the digital infrastructure.
Right.
So Bitcoin is definitely problematic.
Right.
Ethereum already, switched to another modality called proof of stake, which has its own problems, but it has diminished energy by 95%.
Okay.
But in my example that I mentioned, this Chinese group, they, the tokens are coined through your work. It's called contributions, right?
Right.
So it's not energy intensive. It's, you do something, you log in your contribution, there's a peer-to-peer like check, if you like, and say, yeah, that's genuine. And then you have a token. That token hasn't cost anything.
What do they actually do? How do you earn those tokens?
I'm not sure exactly how that works.
It's like work in some kind of creative digital field, and these are all technologists that share.
Like organize a conference for them,
okay.
Or manage the estate,
anything.
Or and you get paid, but you also get these tokens because that means you contribute a lot to the community.
This is a lot like Bernard Luter's idea of intentionally designing financial systems as collectives and not as simply trades of value.
Yeah. That's it. That's absolutely it. It's a community. Yeah. It's a real community. Do you know holochain? Because I think that's also an interesting development. So the problem with Bitcoin, Ethereum, they create a global computer.
Right.
And every transaction needs to be copied with all the transactions that have gone on before. It's very expensive. Right. That's why it's exponential. Holochain says, no. Let's do it completely peer-to-peer. So basically, everybody can create its own ledger.
Okay.
Right? Which is local, doesn't cost anything. And then you decide whether you want to connect to another ledger or not. So it's totally interoperability, totally standardized. And so it's like a totally bottom up. So that's kind of, so these solutions exist. And whether it will work or not, this is still an open question, but lots of people are working on this. And this is, I can't predict the future, but I think these are things that need to be watched. Right? That's what I'm doing. I'm an observer of what people are actually doing. A lot of things don't work. But think about startups, like is it 3% of startups that survive 5 years?
It's very low. I don't.
So capitalism is already very redundant, right? It creates a lot of churn. Right. Maybe the Commons creates even more churn. I wouldn't be surprised. But it's like a Darwinian, a continuous experiment, right? And so one of the ways to look at crypto is also as a continuous experiment. Like, for 10 years now, these people have been doing things, and I'm confident because they survive, throughout. Like, if you're in crypto when it's $3 trillion, that's maybe because you're greedy. But if you're still in crypto with 1 trillion, that means you have another motivation, and it's like a religion. Like, it's so if you're a crypto libertarian, you believe in this, right? And that gives you strength. to go to the long term. Just as if you're a communist or a Catholic, whether you believe in a belief or not, the thing is that human beings need stories, and it's better to have a story that carries you long than a story that can lose its meaning, because then you have to find a new story, and every time you don't have a story, you're depressed. So the universe is constituted of meaning, right? For human beings, it's not matter, it's also matter and energy, but it's meaning. Without meaning, we die. And so ideology, seen in a positive way, is any narrative that is sufficiently, reflective of reality, so that you don't
like Chinese cryptocurrency, or young tech. I mean, that's they're Chinese, and other ones, the Pan-African ones. Other ones you're saying like the libertarian communities that
it could be non-ethnic, right? You don't need to be like Chinese.
Well, I'm not saying it has to be, but the point is reality. That's an ideology that is binding these people to stay together, to keep trying it, to keep building these infrastructures.
So in the case of the Chinese, it's very clear to also like, what is our identity today, right? That they're struggling with their identity, and they don't always like what's happening in their country, and so they're thinking like, what is it to be Chinese today, like, and they're also social. So I read the article of the founder, and it's basically like, how can digital communities help local communities? So there's a lot of libertarians are not that way, but they are that way. They're not even Chinese centric. They are, they want to serve, like they're in Chiang Mai, and they're working with a school of orphans to help the school of orphans. So I think this is, this is great.
That sounds like a positive note to end. Is any further questions, John?
No, that was it. Yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah, that was great.
I appreciate.
Very stimulating.
John's one of the original people who's hired on my circular economy project, and we have been postponing that monthly meeting we've supposed to been having for several months. But I've just finished the Korean Wave book, and all of that might be talked about a bit on Monday too. And he and I both have a conversation. We'll try to record that as well. I will make this available online as well for people who would like to see the entire thing and weren't available. So that's your option as well. Any further things you'd like to say right now?
I just wish I joined earlier, but the time constraint.
That's why we recorded.
Yeah, I'll watch that
Saturday.
recording.
It's Saturday. I mean, the point is, it's we're being realistic. So thank you for joining. Good feedback. That's what Michel wanted, to have some kind of commonality. Where if you are located, please email me. And we might even meet up if you're available too. Yeah. But anyway, thank you, and we will be signing off. Take care.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. I
Thank you.
appreciate it. Thank you very much. Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.